It seems President Trump is going to war with Jerome Powell because he's not cutting rates fast enough. Can a sitting president have a FOMC chairman removed? Well, technically speaking, yes, but certain criteria needs to be met. And even if that criteria is not met, there are still ways around it. Sit tight because we're going to dive in. I'm going to cover everything that you need to know about what's going on with the FOMC and President Trump and why it's pretty critical to have this situation resolved. In 1935, Franklin D. Roosevelt tried to have William Humphreys removed. They had disputes, and this was challenged by Humphreys in a legal process. He later died, but the case was won, and it was put into effect based on that ruling. The Humphreys Executor, which is a staggered 14-year term for the FOMC chairman. So this way, they can't be directly removed for a dispute or a disagreement on federal interest rate cuts or hikes. There was also an issue with Lyndon B. Johnson in the 60s where he tried to have William Martin removed. So this has happened many times. Now, there is a couple of ways that Trump could go about this. He needs to have cause, like neglect or inefficiency. And right now, it seems to be arguable that there is some inefficiency. If he could prove that, Jerome Powell would be removed by a superior court. There's also another way that Donald Trump could have Jerome Powell removed, and that is rolling back the Humphreys executor. If Humphreys gets rolled back, this would be very critical in removing Jerome Powell since he's been in this position since 2018. That is 7 years. That's halfway through his term already. Jerome Powell has been on the Board of Governors since 2012, which means his term ends in 2026, May of 2026 to be exact, which means no matter what, he is out May of 2026. He has about 1 year left. Now, 14 years on the Board of Governors, you serve 4 years as a chairman, and you can be reelected to that position for 4 more years. Donald Trump can prove neglect or inefficiency, then he can remove Jerome Powell, or he can roll back the Humphreys, pretty much roll back anywhere from 14 years back. He will automatically be on his way out because he's in his last year anyway. However, Jerome Powell doesn't have direct control over interest rate cuts. The FOMC does, which is the Federal Open Market Committee, a 12-member committee that essentially makes the decisions to cut interest rates. Another thing to mention, that Fed Governor Kevin Warsh, who was appointed by George Bush, is essentially more hawkish to some degree than Jerome Powell, and interest rate cuts may come even slower. And he apparently told President Trump to let Jerome Powell finish his term. So this is kind of all up in the air. This is a very sticky situation, in my honest opinion. I don't really know what the right path to this will be, but essentially rate cuts are really needed sooner than later, but tariff negotiations are needed just as much, if not more. We really need both, and we need them both to happen quickly. And talking about interest rate cuts, one would say, especially Jerome Powell, that interest rate cuts would spike inflation, and they would definitely create some form of elevated inflation to some degree in the mid to short term, which means in the next 2 to 3 or 4 months, we could start seeing some inflation with rate cuts. It's very possible. However, I would rather have slightly or moderately elevated inflation than to run the risk of stagflation and go into a recession with a very volatile energies, futures, stock market, and extremely volatile and inflated and unstable bonds. This doesn't make any sense. So cutting rates is ultimately the safer play here because we're trading inflation for a potential recession. Now, we saw what happened in 2022. This is definitely a better scenario than it currently is. So what Trump needs to do is figure out a way to get these interest rate cuts and work out deals and negotiations on tariff talks, because this is very important to understand. If we can get some deals with the tariffs and get some negotiations going, then we ultimately are headed down the right path. And then you couple that with some interest rate cuts that really is going to boost the economy, and it's going to help out immediately. The reaction would be the same day, probably. The stock market would go crazy. Another important thing to talk about right now is the fact that pretty much everything going on in the stock market is essentially rigged or heavily manipulated. In fact, there's been a lot of talks over the past several days, actually almost a week at this point, that I've read that have said that Donald Trump has already been speaking to China even at the time he paused tariffs, and that things looked like they would be going well. And then recently, yesterday, it was released that Trump said that he's in good talks with China. And I quote, "It's like really very good." So this means that they've been talking to China. Now, when we look at dark pool data, all of the bearish options, like all of the long puts and the short calls, are all pretty much expired April 17th, and there's more expiring April 25th, and some on May 2nd. But most options on May 2nd, and even more so on May 9th and May 16th, are short puts and long calls, meaning bullish. And dark pool data shows this, which means it's almost like Trump and China have already worked out a deal. It's almost like they've worked out a deal or something, and they're letting this play out to shake up the bond market, shake up futures, energies, the stock market, to try to force Jerome Powell's hand. But since this is not happening, now he's trying to have Jerome Powell removed, and the good talks with China just so happens to have taken place yesterday on Friday. When you think about this, it seems to me that they've already been talking, but since he can't get Jerome Powell to cut rates, he's just releasing that info to help spike a move in the stock market, and he's going to try to remove Jerome Powell anyway. What's very interesting, and you might want to pay attention to, is that we didn't hear anything about China and Trump talking until a day or two after Jerome Powell didn't cut rates yet again, and Trump has immediately called for him to resign and is now studying and trying to have him removed. Now, out of nowhere, Trump is speaking with China, and talks are going well, according to Trump. I got a funny feeling, like I said, that this talk with China has taken place much earlier than yesterday or the day before. It's kind of been going on, and he's trying to force the Fed's hands. That's what this seems like. When you add it all up, you have all these tariff announcements that took place in February. The stock market got shaky. It dumped. Bond market got shaky. Energies, futures got shaky. He posted. Now is a buying opportunity. Then paused tariffs. Everybody bought in. Big money brought a ton of money over from the sidelines into the stock market. It flew, and then Trump was pushing for rate cuts, didn't get them, and so the market started to react to that and started falling more and more on certain data, although inflation was down. Other data was kind of rough, so the market started selling off, which has completely created a war between Trump and Powell, so to speak. And now he can't get Powell to cut interest rates. And now China has apparently started talking to Trump. When you add all of this together, it almost seems like Jerome Powell not cutting rates with the new hawkish members that are on the committee has kind of stalled the plan of all this money, big money on the sidelines and with Trump. And because they couldn't get those interest rate cuts, they're now going forward with the already planned out, so to speak, deals with China. I think this is a likelihood. And I really believe that they've already been talking to China and they've been holding off on this. So this way they could get interest rates cut. I'm not 100% sure on this, but it seems like a lot of this is manipulated and it's very hard to tell exactly what's happening. But even in the event this isn't the case, it looks like Trump is talking to China and Jerome Powell does not want to cut interest rates. So we do have these two very strong and looming issues in front of us. If Trump can work out a deal with China, well, it's going to be quite easy to understand what the stock market's going to do. And if we get rate cuts on top, it's going to fly. A lot of the data points to a bullish sentiment for May. And I believe this upcoming week is going to be great. A lot of people go on vacation during holidays. It's Easter. And what do people do? They pull money out of the stock market, which means they're going to sell some positions, take some money out, and they're going to go have fun for the weekend. Plus all of the bearish news that have been coming out. When Monday comes around, we have the Prime Minister Meloni from Italy that had negotiations with Trump. Now he's announcing talks with China, and the weekend and the holidays are over. So people put money back in their brokerage and or start trading. So between those three things, it's likely that futures gap up overnight on Monday, I have a video coming out for you guys tomorrow discussing all of the details on what I would be doing on Monday, so stay tuned for that. If you guys want to learn all of the things I teach my students to understand this market and to grow your portfolio and retire early, I would love to help you. It's what drives me every single day. You can sign up at investwithcorey.com. The link's in the information box below. Just click on training and you'll be able to book a call with my team and I so that I can get started to help you grow your portfolio. I will see all of you guys on the next video and in the Discord real soon. That video right there is for you. I will see you over there.